KXL. I'm Clay Lewis here in Ground Zero. And the numbers to call tonight, 503-417-7575. 503-417-7575 or 1-800-827-0750. Tell you what, my world's being blown away right now, listening to Doug Dietrich tonight telling me about the space program. Of course, 50 years ago, this week, the Soviet Union is celebrating their first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. And it's a fascinating study in what really is going on behind the scenes, what really went on while we were all frightened of what was above us, a war in space, a space race. It was hypothetical, and basically it was an athlete that really didn't want to fight a war in space, but the Soviets were forced into it. Hearing from Doug Dietrich tonight, talking about breaking the sound barrier. The Japanese did so before Chuck Yeager did it. Japanese died in the process, but Yeager was the first guy to live through it all. Doug Dietrich is my guest tonight on Ground Zero. Very interesting guest. If you have a question for Doug, it's 503-417-7575 or 1-800-827-0750. Now, we talked about breaking the sound barrier. We talked about the Wright brothers. We've talked about a number of things. We're moving along in history along the timeline here.
Right.
Let's talk about the Nazi influence on the space program before the Soviets started moving into getting man out in space. How was it that the Nazis, what kind of technologies were they passing along to American interests and to Russian interests?
Well, what we have to remember is that the ceasefire in World War II, when the Soviets and the Americans were breaking into the territory of the Reich itself, forget everything you read about all of the popular memoirs from German citizens or propaganda by the Americans that the Germans thought it was great to surrender to the West and they were trying their best to escape the Soviets. All of that is true in the sense that that's great for the German population, but that's lousy for Nazi leadership. So as far as the Nazis were concerned, they're fighting equally as hard in the West as they were with the East, only they were using a different approach to how they were going to settle things with the West as opposed to how they were settling things with the East. But without getting too much into the dynamics of that, one of the things that Americans need to know about is Dr. Wernher von Braun is well known for coming over to the United States. What they didn't know is that he arranged for his brother Heinrich, who agreed to this, to surrender to the Soviet Union. And in this way, you had Nazi rocketeers who were working on either side of the Iron Curtain, and they were basically modulating the development of these space programs, actually retarding them in a very real fashion. So in a sense, confirming some of Richard Hoagland's fears. But at the same time, Dr. Wernher von Braun grew increasingly frustrated because unlike the Soviets, the Americans were actually hampered by a real solid occult ideology, which a lot of Americans tend to project onto the Third Reich, but what they tend to forget is, for instance, the heavy influence of American Freemasonry in terms of like Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong.
What about Jack Parsons?
Jack Parsons definitely was. He was like, if Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin are the symptoms by running up a Masonic flag on the moon before they ran up the American flag, Jack Parsons is the disease. He basically is the man who hijacked it from Dr. Robert Goddard, who in 1926, Robert Goddard inspired everything that the Nazi rocketeers did by basically unknowingly starting the space age when he launched the first liquid fuel rocket. That was in March of 1926. And in July of 1929, a launch failure of the first instrumental rocket caused all of his neighbors to obtain an injunction preventing further launches in Massachusetts. The development was ridiculed in the press. Goddard became almost pathologically reclusive and moved to Roswell, New Mexico, where he could get a Guggenheim grant from Charles Lindbergh to continue funding a private space program. However, the American military thought that there was no military use for his rocket.
What were they testing in Roswell at the time of the Roswell crash, if you could reveal to my listeners? They were testing saucer technology, am I correct?
Oh, no. If we go to the Roswell crash, if you're referring to 1947, as I said, the peace treaty and World War II between Japan and America certainly came to an end, but it didn't come to an end until 1951. And this is something that certainly needs to be emphasized. What a lot of Americans don't understand is when the emperor, after the atomic bomb, comes out and says we must bear the unbearable, we must endure the unendurable, he certainly makes no mention of surrender, capitulate, failure, or defeat. These are totally absent from his imperial rescript. and the war continued legally, what you had was a ceasefire on the battleship Missouri that was signed, and I could go into that for quite some time, but it takes a lot of going into, so we might save that for another show, specifically the Roswell show itself. But the war was still legally on, and this is proved by the fact that there were several Japanese prisoner of war camps that were opened up in California not until 1945, at the time of the ceasefire. Those prisoners of war were literally there until the signing of the peace treaty at the San Francisco Presidio military base in 1951. And as prisoners of war, the Americans were abusing them because the Japanese had never been signatory to the Geneva Convention. And as a result, the prisoners of war were not subject to Geneva rules. And the Americans were using them as torture test subjects and torturing them to force them to reveal to the Americans how to use the weapons that they had been captured in. And the weapons that were deployed over Roswell were massive dirigibles, well over...
What do you think about the new document that's been released by the FBI saying that Roswell did happen, that there were saucers found in Aztec, Corona... and everything else. I mean, they said saucer technology. The FBI admitted it in their vault.
Well, what we have to do is we have to confirm exactly what the Roswell documents say from their vault of the FBI. The original FBI documents that refer to, and this is something I bring up in my presentations concerning Roswell, and certainly will do so hopefully on the anniversary of Roswell, go into great detail about this, is that there were well over 20 incidents of crashing quote-unquote saucers within the Four Corners region. And we even have as far up into like it may be as far as like the 1950s, where you've got them crashing in places like Pahrump, Nevada, or very close to it. There are like various areas all over the Four Corners region where these things are crashing again and again. We are not going to be getting this with some kind of alien incursion that, unless they're having U-2 type flights that are just regularly going over our atmosphere.
So the saucers were ours, or the saucers were the German technologies given to us to use in the Soviet Union?
German and Japanese technologies that were being tested, but a lot of them using Japanese prisoners of war to try and force them to pilot it.
So that is why they looked like they had the almond-shaped eyes, right?
Yes, that was one part of it. Also, they're suffering from third-degree burns.
Progeria?
Yeah, I'm sorry?
They had progeria as well, from what I understand. Being around the saucer technology and the new engines caused progeria, caused them to age faster and have them shrink.
That's one of the thesis of Nick Redfern, actually, but that's not actually the case. What happened was that the crew of the original dirigibles that were sent over by Hirohito, that actually helped bring the war to an end, what actually forced the Americans to sue for peace, were containing just literally loads of biocidal weapons. And the biocidal weapons were extremely virulent, and they had no range, because once the diseases started spreading, they would spread and they would spread. He definitely had them sent over to Area 51, where they landed, and the Japanese were well aware, something that I brought up in my presentations before, of exactly what was where in the American technological stream of developmental areas. They knew that Area 51 was where the Americans had developed their jets. The Japanese had actually been flying reconnaissance throughout American airspace throughout the war. These were reconnaissance planes that took off from Japanese submarines, which had catapults to launch planes. The planes had seaplane landing gear, so they could land on the ocean and get craned back onto the submarine and reload it. But this level of reconnaissance was extremely aggressive, went on all the while they launched thousands and thousands of balloon bombs into the United States, whose purpose was to cause tremendous forest fires so that they could monitor where the wind was blowing.
And one of the balloon bombs landed here in Oregon, from what I understand, and killed somebody.
Well, there were many balloon bombs that landed. There were many people that were killed, but the one that was most famous had to do with, I believe his name was Mitchell. I'll have to look it up again. Certainly I bring it up in my presentation. We're going to be selling the DVD at the Conspiracy Con, where I certainly hope to see as many people as possible.
Yeah, I would agree with you, too. We got to take a break, but, the